On the night of February 23, 1771, in the luxurious royal apartments of the royal palace in Stockholm, a grotesque scene unfolded. The corpulent 61-year-old King Adolf Frederick of Sweden was slumped in his chair, breathing heavily. His face, normally pale as was common among Nordic nobles, now displayed an alarming shade of purple. Alarmed servants ran in all directions while court physicians bent over the dying monarch. On the floor and on the table were the remains of a monumental feast. Empty plates that had once held caviar, herring, lobster, sauerkraut, and dozens of cream-filled buns. His favorite dish, Semla, which he had devoured with uncontrollable voracity. Between spasms of pain that racked his body, the king tried to speak, but only unintelligible grunts escaped his lips. His hands clutched his distended stomach while doctors, helpless before the macabre spectacle, whispered to each other words like apoplexy and stomach congestion. A few hours later, the man who had ruled Sweden for 20 years was dead. Not from murder, not from war, not from contagious disease, but from the most prosaic and shameful of excesses, unbridled gluttony. The official cause of death was recorded as digestive problems, a diplomatic euphemism for what really happened. Adolf Frederick literally ate himself to death. This peculiar death, perhaps unique among European monarchs, became the central historical memory of a king who would otherwise have been largely forgotten. To understand how a sovereign of one of the most powerful nations in Northern Europe ended his days so ignominiously, we need to return to the origins of this singular figure and to the events that shaped his reign and ultimately his fatal appetite. Adolf Frederick was born on May 8, 1710, at Gottorp Castle in what is now Schleswig-Holstein, Germany. The son of Duke Christian August of Holstein-Gottorp and Albertina Frederica of Baden-Durlach, he was not destined to be a king. As a member of a German ducal house, his initial expectations were modest, managing his estates, serving as a military officer, or perhaps with luck obtaining an administrative position at some European court. Fate, however, had much grander plans for the young duke. Adolf Frederick's rise to the Swedish throne was a direct result of the political intrigues that dominated Northern Europe in the 17th century. Following the death of the powerful warrior King Charles the Big in 1718, Sweden had adopted a limited monarchy where the true political power resided in the parliament, known as the Riksdag. The throne passed to Charles's younger sister Ulrika Eleonora, who soon abdicated in favor of her husband Frederick the Fair. Since the couple had no children, a succession crisis arose. The election of a new monarch became a diplomatic battleground. Russia, ascendant under Tsar Peter the Great, pushed for a candidate favorable to its interests, while France sought to maintain its traditional influence in the region. In 1743, after complex negotiations, Adolf Frederick was elected Crown Prince of Sweden. This was largely thanks to the support of Empress Elizabeth of Russia. This choice was not based on his exceptional talents or personal ambition, but on his political malleability and family connections. When he finally assumed the throne in 1751, following the death of Frederick I, Adolf Frederick faced a tremendously complicated political situation. The Swedish political system was divided between two main factions: the Hats, who favored an aggressive foreign policy aligned with France, and the Caps, who preferred peace and closer relations with Russia. The new king found himself caught between these antagonistic forces with very little real authority to impose his will. In fact, the monarch's power had been so severely curtailed by the Swedish constitution that Adolf Frederick needed approval even to leave Stockholm for more than a few hours. The royal seal necessary to validate official documents was not in his custody but with parliamentary officials. This humiliating reality led the British ambassador to sarcastically observe that Sweden was the nation where the king alone had no freedom. In 1752, Adolf Frederick married Louisa Ulrika of Prussia, sister of Frederick the Great. Unlike her husband, the queen was intelligent, ambitious, and utterly incensed by the limitations imposed on royal power. Louisa Ulrika became the real driving force behind attempts to strengthen the monarchy, frequently publicly humiliating her husband for his passivity. "You are more of a royal gardener than a king," she reportedly once told him, referring to the monarch's favorite pastime, carpentry and gardening. This was not an unfounded criticism. While Louisa Ulrika plotted and schemed to increase the power of the crown, Adolf Frederick actually preferred to spend his time in his wood-turning workshop, where he produced snuff boxes and other small wooden objects. When not occupied with his saw and chisel, the king found solace in his other great passion, food. Contemporary accounts describe royal banquets where the monarch consumed prodigious quantities of food, much to the concern of his physicians. In 1756, yielding to constant pressure from his wife, Adolf Frederick finally attempted to assert his authority. After years of subordination to Parliament, the king and queen supported an attempted coup d'état aimed at restoring monarchical absolutism. The conspiracy, poorly planned and even worse executed, was quickly uncovered. Several conspirators were executed, including some close friends of the royal family. The failed coup had devastating consequences for Adolf Frederick. Instead of increasing his power, he saw his already limited royal prerogatives further reduced. Parliament, now distrustful of the king, began to closely monitor his activities, making his position even more humiliating. For Louisa Ulrika, these restrictions were unbearable. For Adolf Frederick, they seemed to have been just another burden to bear with his characteristic resignation. Deprived of real political power and constantly criticized by his wife for his ineffectiveness, the king increasingly resorted to the few pleasures still available to him. His carpentry workshop became a refuge where he could escape the frustrations of public life, but it was at the table where Adolf Frederick found his greatest solace. Royal banquets, always sumptuous in the tradition of European courts, became increasingly extravagant affairs during his reign, with the monarch himself frequently overseeing the menu. Under his command, Swedish royal cuisine incorporated French and German influences, reflecting the court's international connections. The king had a particular preference for heavy, rich dishes, fatty meats, creamy sauces, and especially sweet ones. His chefs received specific instructions to prepare multiple courses, even for private meals. And the monarch became known for his ability to consume portions that would have satisfied 3 or 4 ordinary diners. While the king found refuge in food, Sweden's political situation continued to deteriorate. Constant fighting between parliamentary factions paralyzed the government, while the country's finances suffered from the effects of the 7 Years' War. Adolf Frederick, with no real power to intervene, passively watched the gradual decline of the nation he theoretically ruled. The few moments in which he attempted to impose his will, usually under pressure from his wife, resulted in constitutional crises that were invariably resolved to the crown's disadvantage. In 1762, following another humiliating political defeat, Adolf Frederick apparently renounced any ambition to strengthen his position. Resigned to the role of royal figurehead, he turned even more to his private pleasures. It was during this period that his gluttony seems to have intensified, with court accounts mentioning episodes of food consumption that bordered on the pathological. During a state dinner in 1765, witnesses report that the king consumed only 1 plate of partridges meant for 6 people, in addition to multiple portions of various other dishes. The royal physicians were naturally alarmed by these excesses. In the letters exchanged between the king's personal physician, Dr. Niels Rosen von Rosenstein, and other professionals of the time, we find references to Adolf Frederick's increasingly frequent digestive ailments and unsuccessful attempts to moderate his eating habits. The monarch, however, consistently ignored this medical advice, possibly seeing food as one of the few areas where he could still freely exercise his will. It is important to understand that in the context of the 17th century, gluttony was not only a matter of health, but also a status symbol. In an era where the majority of the population constantly struggled with food shortages, the ability to consume large quantities of rich and varied food was a tangible demonstration of power and privilege. For a king deprived of political authority, this display of dietary excess may have represented a form of psychological compensation, a way to symbolically assert the power denied to him in the public sphere. The final years of Adolf Frederick's reign were marked by increasingly serious political crises. In 1769, a disastrous harvest led to widespread famine among the Swedish population, while the court continued to feast ostentatiously. The king's unpopularity grew not so much because of his own actions, but because of the perception that he was unable to control the excesses of the aristocracy or alleviate the suffering of the people. In the winter of 1770 to 1771, the king's health began to visibly deteriorate. By the age of 60, he had developed pronounced obesity, shortness of breath, and other symptoms that contemporary physicians attributed to congestion of the humors, what we would recognize today as possible signs of heart failure and metabolic complications. Still, Adolf Frederick refused to moderate his diet, possibly unable to abandon the only consistent pleasure in his life of frustrations. Thus, we arrive at the fateful day of February 23rd, 1771. The date was not a common one on the Swedish calendar. It was Shrove Tuesday, traditionally the last opportunity for indulgence before the onset of Lent. For Adolf Frederick, it would literally be his last banquet. The menu of that fateful night, preserved in the records of the Swedish court, is impressive even by the standards of royal gluttony. The king began with a starter of caviar, smoked herring, sauerkraut, and preserved herring. Already a substantial meal in itself. The main course followed: lobster, kalbsraten, stuffed veal rolls, smoked pork, and turnip soup. As if that weren't enough, Adolf Frederick then consumed champagne with a fermented sweet called headbug. The final straw, however, were semla, sweet breads filled with almond paste and whipped cream. These traditional Swedish buns, normally eaten only on Shrove Tuesday, were a particular passion of the king. That night, according to contemporary accounts, Adolf Frederick consumed 14 of these rich, heavy buns, dipped in bowls of hot milk in keeping with tradition. A few hours after this extraordinary feast, the king began to experience severe abdominal pain. Initially, the situation did not cause great alarm. Digestive indispositions following excessive feasting were common occurrences for the monarch. However, this time the symptoms rapidly worsened, with Adolf Frederick developing intense nausea, cold sweats, and chest pain that doctors of the time described as crushing. The court physicians were hastily summoned and tried the standard treatments of the time: bloodletting to reduce the pressure of the humors, emetics to induce vomiting, and warm poultices applied to the abdomen. Nothing worked. The pains increased. The king's breathing became increasingly labored, and around midnight, Adolf Frederick lost consciousness. He died in the early hours of the following morning, presumably the victim of what modern medicine would diagnose as a combination of acute heart failure and possible gastric rupture exacerbated by extreme overindulgence. The reaction to the king's death was as contradictory as his life. At court, there were official displays of mourning naturally, but also a certain veiled relief, especially among members of parliament who had long viewed Adolf Frederick as an obstacle to their political ambitions. His wife, Louisa Ulrika, who had frequently expressed contempt for her husband's weakness, publicly assumed the role of the bereaved widow, while privately planning how she might influence her son and successor, Gustav Eitzer. Among the common people, the news of the king's death from overeating generated a mixture of mockery and indignation for peasants who frequently faced shortages. The idea of someone dying from overeating seemed obscene, especially in a difficult economic period. Satirical pamphlets quickly circulated in Stockholm, portraying the king with a grotesquely bloated stomach, surrounded by mountains of food, while death, represented as a skeleton, looked on with sarcastic satisfaction. The royal funeral took place with all the traditional pomp, but a palpable unease hung over the ceremony. The funeral orators faced the almost impossible challenge of eulogizing a monarch whose main achievement had been his own political impotence, and whose death exemplified the excesses of kingship. Bishop Jacob Serenius, who delivered the official funeral oration, chose to emphasize the deceased's personal virtues, his kindness, piety, and peaceful disposition, prudently avoiding any mention of the embarrassing circumstances of his passing. Adolf Frederick was buried in Riddarholmen Church, the traditional final resting place of Swedish monarchs, where he remains to this day. His son and successor, Gustav Eitzer, quickly distanced himself from the paternal image, presenting himself as an enlightened and vigorous monarch who would restore Sweden to glory. In a carefully orchestrated coup in 1772, Gustav achieved what his father never could. He restored absolute power to the Swedish monarchy, effectively bringing to a close the so-called era of liberty, which had frustrated Adolf Frederick for 2 decades. The death of Adolf Frederick from overeating quickly became a historical anecdote, frequently cited as an example of the aristocratic excesses that would eventually lead to the revolutions that swept Europe at the end of the 20th century. In Sweden, the date of his death, February 23rd, became informally known as Semla Day, with confectioners selling the very buns that supposedly caused the king's death, now transformed into a peculiar gastronomic commemoration of a royal death. News of the king's death quickly spread beyond Sweden's borders, provoking mixed reactions at other European courts. At Versailles, the Swedish ambassador recounted that King Louis X of France greeted the news with a mixture of disbelief and ill-disguised amusement. "That's worthy of a Molière farce, not a royal house," the French monarch, himself known for his excesses at the table, is reported to have remarked. In Berlin, Frederick the Great of Prussia, brother-in-law of the late king, was less surprised. In private correspondence, he referred to the event as the foreseeable conclusion of a wasted life, adding acidly that my sister deserved a husband more capable both at the dining table and in the council chamber. Even Catherine the Great of Russia, normally discreet in her comments on other monarchs, could not resist a sarcastic remark. When informed of the cause of Adolf Frederick's death, she allegedly replied, "In Russia, men die by the sword or by poison." In Sweden, they seem to be opting for softer weapons. For the European powers, always alert to signs of weakness in rival royal houses, the grotesque death of the Swedish king was interpreted as a symbol of the decline of a nation that a century earlier had been one of the continent's most feared military powers. Ironically, this monarch, who in life was widely despised for his ineffectiveness, gained in death a lasting fame that far more consistent rulers never achieved. While the exploits of great Swedish statesmen and conquerors such as Gustavus Adolphus and Karl the Great are studied mainly by historians, the story of the king who ate himself until he exploded continues to fascinate the general public, regularly appearing in lists of strange deaths and curious historical anecdotes. The case of Adolf Frederick perfectly illustrates how history frequently preserves the bizarre and the anecdotal more vividly than substantial achievements. This man who failed in almost every aspect of his royal role, unable to govern effectively, satisfy his ambitious wife, or even command basic respect from his subjects, achieved in death a kind of immortality through the sheer absurdity of his end. More profoundly, his story serves as a parable about the psychological compensations of impotent power, deprived of real authority. Publicly humiliated and constantly reminded of his inadequacy, Adolf Frederick turned to the only domains where he could still exert control: his carpentry shop and, fatally, his dining table. His death by gluttony ultimately represents not only a personal failure of self-control, but also the final collapse of a dysfunctional political system that reduced its monarch to little more than a decorative symbol. The informal epitaph that circulated after his death starkly summarized this contradiction. Here lies Adolf Frederick, who lived as a subject and died as a glutton. For a man whose reign was marked by insignificance, it was an appropriately memorable end, and the only reason his name is still remembered almost 3 centuries later. The final irony of Adolf Frederick's story is that this king, who never wielded real power in his lifetime, continues to exert a strange posthumous influence. To this day in contemporary Sweden, Semla, that fatal bun, remains extremely popular, with over 40 million sold annually in the country. And when Swedes nibble on these sweets, especially on Shrove Tuesday, many still think with a wry smile of the king who loved this simple pleasure too much. The lesson that endures beyond the obvious warning against gluttony is perhaps about the nature of true historical significance. It is not always the greatest feats that preserve our memory, but sometimes our most spectacular failures. Adolf Frederick, the king who literally ate himself to death, reminds us that history, with its peculiar sense of humor, often favors not the most virtuous or powerful, but those most memorable in their eccentricity or failure.